Today I'm talking with author, podcast host and creator of the YouTube channel Adventures Through the Mind, James W Jesso. Now I'm relatively new to James's work, but I quickly became a big fan, and I want to say a huge thank you to those people in our mutual audience who recommended his channel to me. Now like me, James has a big interest in the community aspect of the psychedelic community, and that's something that we explore here amongst many other topics, and some of it gets pretty deep. He's a very stimulating guy to have a conversation with, and I think the reason I liked it so much is that he's very genuine and self-reflective, so it's like being on a real-time journey with his stream of thought, or at least that's how I perceived it. Now I found this quite fascinating because I tend to be very overly analytical and I'm always trying to think 10 steps ahead, but talking to James really made me focus on the present, and it was surprising how easily we got into some of these conversations. I did notice in myself that there were a few places during this chat where I became a little bit hyperactive and scatterbrained, which creates a bit of a weird contrast with James's very chilled and more contemplative approach. I think it's because I was about to go on vacation just as I recorded this, so my mind was in 20 different places at once. But I really enjoy talking with him, and I hope to do so again at some point. I'll leave the usual links below to James's website and to his YouTube channel, Adventures Through the Mind. I would definitely recommend it. And without any further ado, I bring you James W Jesso.
All set then, Chief?
Yeah. Not sure. I fit the description of Chief, but
everybody fits the description of Chief, mate. That's the thing. It's very versatile. So there's a few. I think it's one of the things about sort of the way, particularly in Northern England, when we use words, we use everything like a Swiss Army knife. We get a lot of leverage out of words. So chief, mate. A lot of different applications of the same word. So everyone's a chief. It's a bonding thing, mate. So
okay, well, we're bonding. Yeah, I heard you talk about this a little bit with Tom on your podcast with him about the versatility of mate.
Well, I mean, it is. Yeah, that's a super good example because you can sort of even. In England, that can even get used threateningly, what I mean? People are starting to have had a few too many drinks and now listen, mate, can your shit. I don't think I need to tell you this, though, because I've been watching a few of your blogs and I see you spent some time in England and sort of, so I guess you've hung around with a few of these. You must have picked up a few of the colloquialisms and stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've what's the word I'm looking for? I've frolicked through England a handful of times, but I spent some substantial enough time to change my verbiage when I lived in Australia. I was also taking quite a number of psychedelics at the time, so cool. The basic syntax by which I describe my relationships was fundamentally altered in a context of profound neuroplastic alterations in the midst of a whole lot of mates and fuck yeah and
well, that's it, especially with Australia, the profanity level goes up even by English standards, I think. So they think it's like a whole art form. Yeah. Cool. So I mean, I guess just for the sort of the people on my channel, probably a good start here would be maybe just kind of introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your own channel and what it is you're sort of what made you want to sort of start a channel and get involved with YouTube and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting when I get asked this question because I don't really have a clear sense of how to describe that. And I know from a marketing standpoint that's a real mistake. And it possibly is, reflective or revealing about the psychology by which my choices are being made, which is that I don't always have a sense of what it is I'm going to end up doing, as clearly as I do in hindsight of what a thing has meant or what it has come to mean over time as a consequence of a series of unintended discoveries about what I thought it was going to be turning out to be what it actually is, which turns out to actually be something else over time. So in that sense, I could tell you how I came to produce the channel and some of the things that I think about it now. So the way that I came to produce the channel came out of a desire to talk about my mushroom experiences. I don't know if you've ever heard of this phenomenon of having profound psychedelic experiences and feeling like you need to tell other people about them.
I've experienced it once or twice, yeah.
But I ended up having quite a profound, personally profound, as in like it had a profound impact. The gravity of these experiences re-altered or altered the very center of my life. But I had a profound series of experiences with psilocybin. And one of those experiences sort of encouraged me, or another way to put it is the mushrooms told me I should write a book about my experiences. So I started writing about it. I was getting a lot of positive feedback from my community about its value. And it was coming into a cultural landscape that lacked the type of perspective that my book was offering from what's publicly available in the sort of like in the common space or in the intellectual commons of the psychedelic culture that is approachable and accessible from the anywhere, everywhere. And I wanted to bring that forth. And so in that, I kind of, I was inspired by Terence McKenna and his ability to travel around and two things. One, his ability to have a career based off writing a couple of books and then doing a lot of talks. And also his premise of find the others. And my sort of sense that what I was doing was hoping to, engender a certain quality of discourse in the culture that I hadn't seen, like I said, readily accessible en masse. And this was, the book was released in 2013. I began writing it in 2011, which is far from, the psychedelic mainstreaming that we would consider as commonplace now. Of course, mushrooms, but there was no, of course, mushrooms in the public discourse, 10 years ago. This is new. Or it's certainly much more so now than it was then. And then I thought I could utilize the book as a way of, like, as an anchoring point. I could use the books and talks as a way of going into a place and inviting a bunch of people to talk about a thing that otherwise they wouldn't be talking about. Otherwise that they wouldn't be sharing with each other because of a number of issues or stigma, fear of, law enforcement, whatever else. Or just not really having a language to talk about their experience, bring them into a centralized space, and then around sort of the artifact of my thinking, which was the book, and the artifact of my thinking, which would be the sort of impact from both a conceptual and also a sort of a social level of people being in the space listening to the talk. I could create cultural spaces for discussion to be had, for people to find the others, essentially. And so I began utilizing the book to do that. It wasn't entirely altruistic. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be successful as a writer. I wanted that to be my full-time gig. I wanted to pay for my life, as in like, I wanted to have the thing that I did, what do you do that for the world be the same thing that I do to bring forth my ability to eat and pay the rent and all the rest. So it wasn't entirely altruistic, but at the time I thought it was maybe more altruistic than it was in hindsight. And that evolved over time. It evolved eventually to the place I was like, okay, now I continue to do that, but that's already now a totally established thing. Psychedelic societies and meetup groups and all the rest. And I thought maybe I could help. The next sort of expression of that might be creating a digital place for it to come in, ongoing conversations. And I wanted that from what could I just drop into the culture and sort of like seed into the culture to see what grows, there's a lot of things that I put in there that in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, that was a really great point in my thinking, but I have since grown out of certain ways of thinking about stuff, talking about stuff. But from a seeding perspective, but also from a selfish perspective of like, I would also get to have conversations with these really awesome people who I think are super switched on, and I could use my podcast as an excuse to do that. But I could also do it in a way where I'm kind of giving back. So I'm like shaking my own hand while sort of shaking the culture's hand. That was a fingers crossed. And that's how the podcast came about. And so since then it's just continued. There was also a sense that with Patreon coming in around the time that I started, I was like, whoa, I could stop doing what I was doing, which was my entire funding of everything I was doing was based on crowdfunding. I was like, yes, I want to make money doing this, but I want to make money from the sense of like, hey, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for free. I'm going to do it because I believe that it's right and good. And if you think it's a good idea, you can help me do it by helping me fund this project, right? And that sort of, Patreon became sort of the next logical step in a crowdfunding mentality when I wanted to make my livelihood producing things for free that are supported by a larger community of people, rather than, say, trying to build up my numbers so that I could rely on advertising funding or product sales or whatever. And so there was all of that. So in all of that sort of mess of sort of causation, there's some sort of magical thread, maybe like Stephen Buhner says around tapping into the secret kinesis of things in order to sort of find that golden thread and sort of follow it as it like both weaves and unweaves your life onwards through time. And the podcast is sort of an extension of that, coming straight out of my world being completely upended and regrounded through a series of incredibly intensive psilocybin journeys. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful story. And just one thing that just popped out to me there, which I think, worth taking a moment to reflect on, is that you mentioned just briefly sort of tense McKenna there. And I often think, we have the advantage of this kind of technology that's sat in between us now. And yet, we often go and watch these old videos of Terence McKenna, who was doing all this kind of what you just described now and sort of what we endeavor to do, but yet doing it in a vastly different age with a vastly, what seems like more limited communications. And, again, but built these very strong community sort of connections and made these recordings, which have lasted time. And it really sort of highlights how incredible that was for him to do that through the 70s and 80s. But still with your own, so the journey that you just described, I think is a brilliant thing. And you mentioned at the beginning, it's not something you had a particular vision for, but I think that in itself is kind of its own vision. It is a journal of your life kind of as it's unfolding and as you change with it. But I think the thing that came through to me there was, and I've picked up on this from watching some of your videos, you do seem to put this focus very much on building community and sort of, you talk about doing it through your book and using the book as a kind of a flag you could plant to then build community around. And I love that idea, and it's something that I've sort of toyed around with myself. And I think, just with sort of how I came across you on YouTube, which was only about a month or so ago, because some of my subscribers recommended, hey, you should talk to James. And so I kind of went out and I looked at some of his stuff. I was like, oh, right, well, why I'm only just finding out about this guy. So I really like his position, seemed very grounded and rational. And I think it's a sign of our times that, it used to be like when I was a kid and you watched TV and you knew who the voices were for like politics or for comedy and stuff like that. But now that we're in this kind of the age that we're in, then there's kind of like people like you or I, when, I'm not getting too grandiose here. We have relatively small-ish, community platforms. But we can almost be like sort of ships in the night at some point, where, previously you had these big Terence McKennas and stuff like that. So the communities that form around sort of, again, people like you or I is now kind of much smaller. We're now in these kind of micro pockets as opposed to these sort of bigger things. And I just wanted to get your feel on that, like how, because we talk about a psychedelic community or a community of like consciousness and stuff like that, but I think part of the age we're in is that these communities are these quite small things. And I kind of, like yourself, I've got an ambition to sort of, do something to bring people together and sort of build this community and build connections. But then, it seems like that's a sort of a harder thing to accomplish in the sort of current age. And I also wonder, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it good to have these little micro communities, or it's sort of, or I don't know, is like the time of older media better of sort of one big figurehead to sort of rule them all kind of thing? So do you have any sort of thoughts on the sort of dispersation of or the how figures like sort of URI fit into this sort of kind of the current communications ecology?
I'm having thoughts now. I'm not sure if I had any planned in advance.
I'm sorry, man.
No. This is good. It's rich. I mean, obviously building echo chambers of like micro pockets, sort of cult-like ideological thinking that sort of reinforces itself as a, like in no small part by its sort of like uniqueness or superiority to the everyone else's perspective is not helpful. And of course, us having that, is a consequence of the technologies, or at least the way the algorithms we have that are forwarding how we're connected on those technologies are sort of like creating those connections or encouraging those connections. But then also we have this capacity to find people. What was the term I had learned a long time ago? To hyper niche and find these tiny little pockets of people who, are thinking and talking about stuff in a way that otherwise maybe you'd feel like a lonely island or wouldn't get a chance to truly and fully flush them out, because a lot of time this sort of dialect or dialectic process, the sharing it is an important part. The sharing it and the getting of feedback is an important part of coming to understand, how you really feel about things, and being able to openly talk about a thing that is charged elsewhere is a great way to get a sense of how you feel about that thing and to get feedback about that thing, and for your thoughts on that to grow and evolve over time. Now, again, there's a lot of issues there about sort of like echo chambering and sort of like self-aggrandizing or sort of ideological sort of like circle jerking around ideas and stuff. But then there's also a lot of concern around if it's not one way, the guilt, like the association fallacy says that if you're not in the right based on what is right, then you're in the wrong, which happens just as much in the mainstream as it does in these micro pockets. So I'm trying to keep a balanced approach as I'm thinking about it. And then So I'm just kind of throwing out what's coming up after what you said. It might not follow one big, larger,
I'm not going to hold
idea.
To fire. It's a freestyle conversation. Just splurge it out.
So another thought that came up there is around community, and I know there's a lot of talk about psychedelic community, and I've been, sort of like, I don't know if guilty sort of like comes with a tone, but I have participated in that kind of talk and don't intend to often, but community is like, or I don't intend to often now, but I have significantly in the past. But community is a very complex word. And what does it even mean to be in a community? Like we can be in a community because we all live together, and we can be in a community because we all ride bikes. And those are two very different kinds of communities. We can be in a community because we're like literally a shared ideological cohabitating sort of community of like a community of praxis towards the world that we want to see, or we could be a community because we all live in the same city, and the what that means when you say community between those two things is very vast. And so I like to think that there are communities of people. So anyone that listens to my show is sort of like could have shared experience, shared interests that could create a community around that. Just like anyone that would listen to your show, and then they could overlap, and then you could build a community, which is a system of connections, or like a larger system of connections of shared interest, purpose, activities, etc., of the people who like both of our shows at the same time. Sure. Okay. And so I see that's there, and I think it's valuable. For me, I try to create a community type space for people who are interested in the things I'm talking about in my show, to talk about those things. The subreddit, for example. I mean, subreddit, I think, is a lot like subreddit or Discord is a lot better place to build digital community than somewhere like YouTube, although a digital community can arise. There's a lot of sort of like random X factor on YouTube that often ends up becoming very polarized and not the type of sort of good faith discussions that I think a community should be founded upon if they're going to be an actual community based in ideas and lifestyle practices. And I think that's positive, and I think that's, and I want to have that. And I want to have that not as a leader of the community, but as a person who's just putting stuff into that space and letting other people take care of it, and then tending to the sort of places in which that community happens. Like I'll delete posts where people are just trying to sell drugs through Instagram because they found out that I have a drug page, right? So I'm just kind of helping to keep that kind of stuff out. But otherwise, and I'll periodically engage, but I'm not trying to lead a community here. I'm not trying to necessarily lead anything. I think of it more in the sense of like, other than trying to lead the entrepreneurial businessness that is my podcast. I sort of lead that in co-creation to what interests me and what seems like relevant details, and then sort of what the larger culture is sort of talking about and speaking about. But I like to differentiate culture from community, and that I see what I'm doing is I'm trying to seed into the culture, not to lead the culture, but to sort of introduce certain things into the mix. And then there will be pockets in that culture, but there's these, these little artifacts of conversation, artifacts of thinking that people can lean into, learn as a consequence of being inspired by, discuss on, critique, comment, whatever. That might change the culture over time, might help contribute to microcultures, like dubstep is a genre, but you'd be, like if you really wanted to be like, yeah, dubstep music, that thing, it's not really. Just like psychedelic culture. Yeah, psychedelic culture, that thing, but not really. Although I don't like to try to get too much into the specific pockets of whatever. I just say like, I'm creating content for psychedelic culture. It's about psychedelics. But I also think psychedelics should be about living. And I think a psychedelic culture, like any culture, if it's truly like a culture, can in some sense sustain itself. And so I try to introduce things that aren't just about psychedelics explicitly or whatever the sort of, I don't know, for example, I will bring in things that are about how to live a good life rather than just things about psychopharmacology or anthropology or whatever, right? So again, that's kind of confused, I guess, but I'm not sure.
I don't think it's confused at all, man. I thought it was a very strange and what we talked about sort of not being a leader, and I would agree. I think that's the kind of the route to just pettiness and infight and stuff like that. I would, when I see your content, I think of you as someone who is driving the community or driving not necessarily leading. And again, not to keep referring back to it, but I think Terence McKenna is a good example here. I don't think he would have ever put himself on a pedestal and said, I'm the leader of this, but he was clearly driving it forward and driving it forward by trying to stimulate that community. And that's the kind of a model I myself try and follow. I don't think it's even possible to have a leader of these kind of psychedelic communities. And I am quite guilty. I do use that phrase quite a lot just because it's easy to use the label and think people know what you're kind of talking about. But yeah, I've questioned, like, is there actually a psychedelic community? I don't think there is, because the spectrum is so broad that really it's like your example of people riding bikes. It's like, well, what does that tell you apart from that they ride bikes? It's just people take psychedelics. But on this hand, you've got people who are doing it purely for hedonistic reasons, and on this hand, you've got people who are doing it because they're for the very far out sort of spiritual reasons and everything in between. So is it really a community? I don't know, but I think what we can do is definitely drive those conversations and drive ideas into the mix and let the ideas themselves kind of play out, and the ideas will sort of work out which is good or which is bad in terms of just how well those ideas are represented. And again, that's why I kind of really like your content, because I thought it was very rational and grounded and still reverent of the beauty and the sort of the transcendence of these experiences. And it's a kind of, I don't know, it's a thing with pretty much all conversations. I always think that those voices in the middle are the ones which are the most needed, but they never quite get the volume of the extremes. But still, I think what you're doing is really cool. And obviously, I think I'd like to get into some of those sort of more extreme sort of viewpoints later on. But yeah, I was one thing I did come across which I wanted to talk to you about.
Can we pause for a second, because I'm curious, but I want to speak to some things that came up as you're talking, which is
please do
this idea of driving and kind of like reflecting on how I had spoken about being a leader or not being a leader, and recognizing that a couple things. I mean, we can be a leader in a number of things, but I think when we're talking about leader, when I was speaking about leader, I had a particular sort of community role in mind. That role is the person who basically directs how people are supposed to behave, think, or engage, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
That's not the type of leadership I want, or I'm advocating for, or, you know, that I'm not like the captain of this community or whatever it is. But then it is, I mean, fair to say that, you know, I am helping to lead a particular direction of thinking about psychedelics in certain sort of pockets of the culture, because I am the captain of my own ship, which is the sort of like curative journey that Adventures Through the Mind is on. So
Sure.
Which is the name of my channel or my podcast. So there can be leaders in that sense, and we can have sort of like sort of thought leaders, which I think are positive and can be positive. And I think there's a leadership in that sense, which I think is positive. Or maybe that's something like a role modelship. Maybe I'm confusing leader with role model here.
Yeah.
But I can
So if I can just sort of, the way I think there is so there's leaders, and, you know, if you think of sort of the leader, we're thinking of, you know, for the extreme example, which for hopefully most people, you know, this is the Sauron, this is the one ring to rule them all, this is your typical, you know, so that there's that kind of leader. But then I think that there's people who are absolutely, you are leading your community, and you are clearly leading your, you know, your podcast. But I think the goal of that is to inject content and ideas into the sort of the culture, and you're not necessarily saying that this is right and this is the fact, and hey, everyone get in line behind my ideas, and going out there like, you know, wagging the finger at people. Hey, if you're not following my podcast, then you suck, or, you know, you're just not, you know, you're not enlightened, you're not spiritual or whatever. So whereas some people definitely do take that angle, and will sort of try and club people away. Like, if you've not done this drug, then you're not really part of this. If you've not done this, if you don't subscribe to these ideas. So I think that's where I would draw that sort of line between, you know, the leader, as in, you know, we could think of like a militaristic dictator style leader, which I think you're definitely not. And I think that is what most people in the sort of, you know, psychonaut community, again, if there is such thing, would sort of repel against. But ideally, leaders for ideas, I think, are definitely needed. And I think that's the sort of the niche I would see you fill in.
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of what type of leadership we're driving for or moving towards. Like, I am looking to be responsible and engaged and of integrity while leading my show, leading my content, leading my own life, right? But I'm not necessarily vying for leadership of others, if that makes sense. So if other people, in hindsight, you know, if other people want to attribute a leader status to, you know, what I'm doing in the culture, okay, sure, right? But that's not necessarily what I'm vying for, you know, not as a part of my goal set anyways, not consciously. Maybe there's some deep inadequacies somewhere in me that I'm not able to see because they're very shadow, and I think I'm doing a good integral thing, but I'm actually just trying to validate my own sense of inadequacy by being special in some way or another, which has, to more or less degree, found itself into my life from time to time. And in hindsight, I'm likely to find more of it where I thought there was less of it at some point, you know? So,
well, that's a Jungian trick there. Once you become aware of these things, then you can't help but go looking for them, and then you sort of, it's
dig forever.
I'm good friends with someone who's a Jungian psychoanalyst and a psychoanalyst, and it's difficult once these concepts enter the sort of conversation to turn it off sometimes, you know, and so you're constantly analyzing yourself and others, and every conversation goes through this filter. So I think as long as it sounds like you're aware of that. And I think, as with anything in this sort of space, you know, no one's going to be a perfect human being. We're all going to sort of make some mistakes, but I think it's the ability to introspect and, you know, am I doing this for the right reasons? Was I out of order then? Should I have, you know, could I have handled that better? These kind of things. I think that sort of introspection is the sign that you sort of your ego is in the right place, that there is some sort of balance there.
Great. Yeah, you're right. I am in the right place. There's no ego here. But
well, there is, but it might be balanced.
I'm just teasing. So something else that I thought about, and I don't want to pull you off of your intended, you know, interview curation here.
Let's take this all right off the rails. It's always better.
Is I'm thinking about psychedelic culture, And even thinking about how I've characterized it and wondering about that now in a way that's kind of different based in the context of this conversation, like context, our psychedelic experiences are context mediated, but so are our revelations in their aftermath in some sense, and that context being the larger context of life in which our journeys happen and are integrated, but also the context ideologically, socially, culturally, in which the sort of conversations and processes by which we come to understand things are nested as well. So in the context of this conversation, I'm thinking about psychedelic culture and my thoughts on, the value of psychedelic culture as a self-sustained thing. And I think maybe more so, I'm realizing it's something like people are going to have psychedelic experiences, and it's going to offer them a lot. A lot of that stuff perhaps is not going to make any bloody sense whatsoever. And some of it's going to make a lot of sense, and maybe not, and maybe so. But when someone has a psychedelic experience and they're trying to make sense of it, they're going to go looking for others who have had those experiences. And the sum total of lifestyle ideas, even aesthetics, whatever, the sum total of how all people who have taken psychedelics have put into the discourse and the understanding of what psychedelics are would be the culture of psychedelics, and that there will be micro pockets and whatever. So,
sure.
And that, some cultures are cultures unto themselves that include psychedelics, but psychedelic culture is basically the entire sort of wash of things that do with and deal with psychedelics. And my thoughts on psychedelic culture from this is in the West mindset, not psychedelic culture as in like Shipibo is the psychedelic culture, something like that. And I'm kind of coming to this, I'm talking this out, so I'm on the edge of my thinking here.
Go for it. It's a beautiful thing to watch. Keep going.
Thanks. And that I feel excited and inspired and curious about how to get to a place wherein psychedelic culture as a larger cultural space that people who have had psychedelic experiences can step into, can find tools, strategies, perspectives, and ways in which they can understand how to apply the most meaningful elements of their psychedelic experiences into the life that they're living, outside of the psychedelic culture in particular, right? The shared sort of interest in psychedelics, participation, etc., which is another thing that kind of taps into community, because although again, I'm interested in building the type of community around my show that I mentioned, I'm not really interested, nor am I increasingly convinced that psychedelic culture or psychedelic communities are going to be like the answer or the truth, the sustained thing that will bring about the whatever grand mythical narrative, grand redemptive narrative of, the collapsing human civilization, whatever.
Well, can I just drill down a bit there? So when you say psychedelic communities, are you thinking of physical communities there?
Yeah,
I would agree. I don't think that's the model that when we talk of psychedelic communities, I'm certainly envisioning some sort of like, a literal physical community of housing and stuff like a Shipibo village, for example. Although certainly that is an example of a psychedelic community that works, because I think that community is not built purely around psychedelics. It's a village that just happens to be in a psychedelic culture. So I don't think that's the way of, hey, I do psychedelics, you do psychedelics. Let's build a food hall and we'll look after each other's kids and stuff like that. But I think that the thing you mentioned earlier around sort of some kind of space, again, not necessarily a physical space, but somewhere where you can put out sort of the tools and the space for people to just feel safe and come and interact with it in whatever way about their own psychedelic experiences. But the thing that I struggle with, I guess, a little bit there is that I'll just repeat a little bit of what you said. Somebody goes and has a psychedelic experience and they want to talk about that experience and they want to try and fit this into their life somehow. And like myself, I'm working a 9-to-5 job. I've got a wife and 2 kids. I'm not fishing on the Amazon and just living in the jungle or anything like that. So I've got a normal life. And I think this is probably the story for many people. So they're trying to fit this amazing experience into Western society, to put it simply. And so I think, this is what you're talking about. Do you want to provide sort of resources for people to be able to do that? And I want to do I have that same kind of goal. I want to put the thought tools out there so that people can integrate these experiences, gain something positive from these experiences, not necessarily get lost in these experiences, sort of be able to do something with it that gives them a better human experience. And and that human experience might be that maybe you have to go back to work on Monday and get you have to sort of go and look after your mother or whatever other parts of your normal mundane human life go on. We can't all just disappear off into the Amazon and sort of spend 3 years living in a Shipibo village. But so that's kind of what I want to get to. And I think as I mentioned, the bit I kind of struggle a little bit with is that I think sometimes you do have to drive these kind of thought tools forward. I appreciate the words I'm using here sound absolutely terrible but I can't think of anything better for them at the moment. But because it is very easy for people to get lost in these experiences, and it is very, very easy for people, I think, to come out of these experiences. People can take them word for word, literally. People can, come to destructive conclusions from them. People can start feeling detached from their friends and family because of they feel like, well, nobody relates to this. So I think that's something where when I think of the conversations and the tools to inject into the culture, that's the kind of things I'm thinking of, is how can I help people rationally and process these things in a grounded way, so that people are not becoming just forever gazing at the horizon, lost in the stars, and completely missing what's going on around them. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I'm having lots of thoughts on it too. One of the things I was getting to say there before you had brought your thoughts there was something along the lines of, I'm interested in introducing into the sort of larger cultural space these tools that you're talking about. Maybe if we were to flesh it out more, we'd find out more or less where our ideas and the tools that we were offering are, more or less harmonious with each other. But is less about how to build psychedelic communities and how to live a life involved with exactly where you are in a way that the psychedelic experiences inspires you to live a richer, fuller, more beautiful life inside of the choices that you've made and the things that are most meaningful to you, which might be fucking off and going to the Amazon for 3 years,
for sure,
from your life at your job. And it might be actually just learning how to be a better father or learning how to be a better partner. So I think that's a big reason why I focus a lot on the psychotherapeutic lens and the sort of relationship angle, because I feel like those are just universal tools for anyone who has like a Western cosmology, is coming to learn how much sort of distortions in our psyche distort our ability to be in relationships, and what the possibilities are for healthy relationships, and what role sort of coming to understand and sort of clear out some of those psychological distortions can play in building those relationships. The extent to which I'm not sure yet. We'll see, I guess, in the long run. But again, this is the edge of my thinking right now. I'm really kind of going there. So I'm really interested in the comment section of this video to see what people point out where they felt like I lost track, or the ideas I didn't speak to or almost spoke to or missed. Because I think that's also a way in which we learn. And that's one of the ways that I'm trying not to be a thought leader in the sense that I'm leading everyone's thinking, but so much as I'm trying to think in a way that invites people to have conversations that help me think more clearly at the same time, by getting feedback from people who are paying attention, switched on, and like coming to point out the holes in what I don't yet understand, or see, whatever it is. So, yeah.
I think honestly, man, I love these kind of conversations. I think something like this where people can just blurt out into the marketplace of ideas, and because there's not, you can certainly come to these things with pre-scripted sort of thoughts or arguments, or and just sort of make a case. But I think these make for not particularly interesting conversations. So I mean, please continue to sort of freestyle and just throw ideas out there, because I think these kind of conversations then can bounce off each other, they can sort of feed each other, and you end up with something that was, perhaps a lot different from what was imagined, which I think is a really sort of cool thing. Mm-hmm. There's something you just said there which I wanted to mention, but it's slipping my mind for the moment. But just to go back, I mean, in terms of the person disappearing off into the Amazon, I wasn't meaning to be dismissive of somebody who makes those choices. Mm-hmm. I think my kind of perspective is that you whatever happens within these kind of experiences, or even not even necessarily within the sort of psychedelic experience, just within life in general, really, I think you should be kind of using it to, be in service to your own experience as a human being. If you're, whatever experience that you have, whether it's the sort of, the people you hang around with, or the psychedelic experiences or whatever that you're having, it's use it in some kind of positive way. And, if I wasn't married and with 2 kids and was 20 years younger, I would definitely disappeared off to the Amazon and gone and spent 3 years, in a Shapiro village. That sounds awesome, but I'm at a different place in my life now, and I do have the kind of the responsibilities of a parent and of a husband, and I am living in the sort of in like the Western world and all the sort of the pressures of just what's going on around me. So that's how I look to these experiences, is like, how can I use these sort of to work through some of my shit, to sort of cut through my own nonsense, to sort of try and be a good father, try and be a good husband, trying to get the best out of my situation. So yeah, I mean, that would be the sort of the message I tend to try and give to anybody is use these things to make the best of your human experience, because I think this is what is kind of most important, is your experience as a human being. And if that sucks for whatever reason, then, and maybe you can get some insight into how to change it, then I think that's the useful thing to get out of it, rather than sort of necessarily getting lost in the psychedelic fireworks or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a couple things, one of which is the idea of like throwing things out into the marketplace of ideas. We also have to be responsible with that. And I think that's something that you have in mind, although you didn't speak to it explicitly, is that, being people who other people listen to, it's our responsibility not to be irresponsible or flippant or dangerous, in the sense of like creating harm by being flippant or irresponsible in the things that we say and the way that we talk about stuff. So that said, and I feel like, based on listening to your show, that is just like an implicit sort of basis upon which a lot of your ideas are shared. What was the other thing I was just going to say there? Oh, also, I think that there are all sorts of different ways to take psychedelics and all sorts of things that we can get out of it, and that's different for different people at different times in their lives, in different cultural pockets, and what works for us could just blatantly, from like a sense making perspective, could just blatantly be completely off base for another person. And
for sure.
I kind of try to keep that in mind too. I'm not trying to speak so that everybody listens and understands. I'm trying to speak in a way that is understandable, so that those who are, those that it makes sense for can make sense with it, rather than whatever. And even that for myself, it's like the language around that comes itself. And I want to be mindful of this too, sort of comes from this generous, compassionate place of being like, yeah, I want to help do good for the world, and this is the way in which I can do it. But then there's also that sort of like slippery slope, which is where the responsibility comes in as people in this position in the culture of being a leader in certain areas of thought, is to not fall into the sort of like messianic, like, I'm here to save the world, I'm here to make psychedelic culture a better place, I'm here to whatever. Mm-hmm. My thoughts are like, and maybe this is something similar for yourself, it's like, I'm here to do whatever my part is, and I think at this point it's this, but I'm not sure yet, but this is about as much as I understand it to be. So I'm going to keep doing it like this until I learn otherwise. And hopefully I do more good than harm in the long run, because that's what I believe I'm supposed to be doing insofar as my tiny little role in something way larger than myself, which is not a covert way of saying my really important place inside of the big thing, if that makes sense. So kind of just putting a call to that, and sort of making sure that that's kept in mind as we're talking, and then as I'm thinking, I guess. As people are listening.
I think the thing that I think I would try and sort of steer around there is that are you sort of, and again, it's definitely not a perfect sort of line, but are you giving someone sort of, are you enabling their agency and their ability to sort of take, giving them tools to sort of to navigate their own experience, or are you sort of telling them what to think? And I think that's the thing I repel against again is the sort of the Sauron figure of, no, this is it, this is the answer, do this or else you're doing it wrong. And where I would sort of lead to like, no, hey guys, have some agency, apply some sort of, critical thinking. I mean, I often try and state like I'm no leader. I'm just someone offering an opinion into this kind of marketplace of ideas. And I think that's where I sort of draw the line. But yeah, I mean, there are clearly people who are giving very sort of definitive instruction on what is right and what is wrong within this space. Mm-hmm. And it ties into, you mentioned a little bit around sort of people having, pursuing different sort of psychedelic experiences and different things. And one of the things sort of that I've come across is that with these kind of figures who do this, then typically there will be some sort of extreme or some sort of benchmark which it will set where unless you have done this, then you are not sort of qualified. And I'm going to stop dancing around the subject now and so I'll link this to sort of someone who I know we both mutually talked about before, which is, and I don't want to wail on the guy at all, but he is.
Are you going to say Leo Gura?
No shit. But I was watching the video that you did where it was yourself and one of your friends who you would. Chad, yeah. And again, I don't want to wail on Leo too much, but I think there was something you described in that video which I think was a really good way of summing up some of the more dangerous aspects here. And it was this concept of a challenge that you described, whereby it's like, I'm going to do something extreme. In Leo's case, it was 30 days of 5-MeO DMT, and then this then
not just 5-MeO DMT, 30 days of 5-MeO DMT in a bathtub alone. That was the degree to which it was not only extreme, but Chad and I both agreed was dangerous from a accidental promotion, like, or inadvertent promotion of the process. But sorry, please.
No, I would absolutely agree with that part was dangerous, but I don't think the bathtub part was part of the challenge. It's certainly not the challenge that I've seen Leo's followers push out. They will always say, well, have you done 30 days of 5 minutes? The bathtub bit gets kind of left in the background. And I think for good reason, because the bathtub thing got a little bit weirder when he started talking about setting up his laptop. And so it became less of something he could use as a challenge part. But certainly this concept of, I did this extreme piece of drug use, you've not, so therefore you're not qualified to have an opinion. And that only works on the basis that we all agree that his thing is like the best thing ever, and not everything else is kind of pales in comparison. Whereas I hear you talk a lot about mushrooms and that these are very influential in your development. I've spent quite a bit of time in South America with doing sort of ayahuasca, and that's been very instrumental in my development. So I really dislike this kind of pissing contest mentality that people have got to sort of outdo each other through these things, because I don't think that's not where the I think where the real insight is. I can certainly respect sort of like say what like Leo did there with this 30 days of 5-MeO is a very, sort of courageous sort of psychonaut thing to do. I'm not necessarily sure it's a productive thing to do, but I can certainly.
Well, also his ability to render it as a story that is moving and seemingly, apt in a lot of ways in describing his experience. Also something that's like, I really respect his ability to storytell that experience.
His communication skills are superb, yeah. But I actually think his communication skills are outpaced by his introspection skills. I think his ability to weave a narrative is superb. His ability to consistently apply that to himself, and to sort of, because I mean, his narrative is always changing. It's always that he's always leveling up through these different awakenings, and he'll discover something new that resets all the previous stuff. And I mean, which is fine if I think if from the perspective of if I'm on a journey and here's my subjective experience, that's absolutely fine. But then when you're at each stop, as you lay down the law and say, hey, no, this is the absolute truth of the universe, everyone get in line, or or you're just an idiot, then I think it gets a little bit sort of problematic.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm not sure what other commentary I have to offer to that. I mean, the behavior that you're describing, I think, can be problematic, but I believe that you were getting on a point towards something about the danger of the implicit challenge provoked into the community, the challenge of like necessary to accomplish in order to have a valid perspective on what is true, which was defined by the parameters of what he states to be truth as a consequence of his experience. Is that kind of what you're pointing at?
Well, yeah, there's two parts to that. One is there is the danger aspect of it. Doing a lot of any substance, within sort of short space, there is inherent risk there. And certainly, as in that particular case, there was the extra risk of you mentioned around the bathtub. But then I think there's an intellectual risk as well, in just that this kind of mentality of, hey, if you've not done this, then you can't compete, you can't contribute, because you don't know, you just don't know, James, you don't know what lies beyond 30 days. So yeah, pat you on the head. You come back when you've done that, and then you'll be on the level of God Emperor Leo sort of thing. And again, it's only by this benchmark if we all agree, well, that's the most powerful thing. But I think, if I find it would sort of ridiculous that if I was going to sort of put out there that my entire credibility depends on, hey guys, have you guys done 12 back-to-back, ayahuasca ceremonies in the Amazon jungle with the people? Well, I have. If you've not, then you just don't qualify. And then we all have to, who agrees that my thing's better? Hey guys, have you done sort of like, daily 6 kambo sessions every day while staring at the sun, with a feather stuck up your ass? It's how do we come up with these hierarchies of what leads to the most spiritual or enlightened experience ever? And I think it completely belittles the experience itself, because again, you don't need to do something so extreme to have a very profound spiritual moment, or whatever you want to call it, awakening or whatever. I really don't like that term, but so yeah, I think the danger there is just in the promotion of more and bigger equals better, more profound.
Yeah, I can appreciate what you're saying there. I can recognize that. I don't think I have enough of an opinion right now on Leo Gura to confirm nor deny that what you're saying is an accurate description of him, although from what I understand, it seems pretty accurate. And what you're saying, separate from Leo, seems to make a lot of sense to me. So yeah.
Cool. I mean, I just briefly mentioned kambo there, and it's something I don't actually get a chance to talk about much. And I saw from one of your blogs that you'd sort of done a kambo on a few occasions. And I was watching this blog, and there's something that I thought was really cool that you mentioned. And I think this was on your last trip to England. I think you were talking about, and you're saying that you were going to do kambo, or I might have this sort of story a little bit mixed up, but you did it, and then it did kind of what it's supposed to do, in that it's this kind of, healing of your spirit, and it took away some of the heartbreak that you're feeling from the ending of a relationship, and you felt that that was something you wanted to hold on to a little bit. And I was watching that, and I just thought, what a sort of a beautiful recognition of just these human experiences, because I think what a lot of what people are looking for is, to put it into soundbite mode, reduce all suffering. People want to get rid of all suffering, and they want to do this by becoming enlightened, and they have this kind of, everyone's looking for the quick fix to sort of the spiritual problems. What you were saying in that video was like, no, actually, I want to feel this pain. It's important. It's part of this experience. And that's something that I think is very, like I say, it really resonated with me, because I was sort of troubled by the loss of my mother at a very early age. She committed suicide, and I'd come to realize as I got into my sort of around about the age that I am now, that this was something I hadn't dealt with, and I wanted to feel it because I knew I hadn't felt it before, and it meant something to feel it. And again, this can sound sort of quite almost like masochistic or something, that you want to feel. You want to bodily experience these griefs and these heartaches. And I was having a conversation with someone the other day where they were talking about becoming enlightened to never have to feel these things again. Like, why would you want to feel, these pains? And I was like, well, what if my daughter died? Like if my daughter was just knocked over its side, how could you not feel that? How could you not want to feel that? So I just wondered if you could sort of, I don't know if you elaborate on that, or if you had any sort of further thoughts on this kind of, this idea of embodying your feelings versus the, I guess like the kind of the head in the sand, or the idea of enlightenment to just wash it away to all to happy land.
Well, I want to preface, and I probably should have said this before, although maybe it was implied, that I don't think that I have the absolute answer to these things. They're very complex and they're very contextual, but some ideas that I have will be as followed. One of the things that came up as you were just talking about that, and interestingly enough, instead of doing the thing that I had meant to do, which was reading a little bit of Stephen Buhner's Ensouling Language to inspire my feeling sense before I dipped into the writing process, I ended up just sort of like on my email, mistake, and then seeing that my Google One account was almost done. Oh, I should update that. One thing led to the next, led to less. But then I spent quite a bit of time flipping through my pictures, and this is coming around, pictures of my last trip to Thailand. And I had a beautiful experience there. Not always easy. Actually, at one point I had like a total collapse of an important part of myself. And actually, maybe this goes in. And I was reading Robert Augustus Masters' Spiritual Bypassing, which for the listeners, if you haven't read this book or aren't aware of Robert Augustus Masters' work, it's a very, I personally think he's, for me, one of the most inspiring people I have for understanding my spiritual journey as a gross human with farts and fights and, like strivings and bliss and all the rest. Mm-hmm. And I was taking pictures of the book, and one of the pictures I took was a quote that said something like, he described the complete liberation of all pain and suffering. And he said, this is a dream. This is not a dream to be striving for. This is a dream we should be striving to awaken from. That using spirituality in this way is ultimately using spirituality like a tranquilizer rather than something that awakens us. And at the time, one of the things that I was there in Thailand to do was to study sexual qigong, sexual tantra, something that was very important to me. And on some level, the essence of it is still important to me, but that's maybe a whole other discussion. But reading his book, I had come to recognize, I was painfully affronted by the recognition that the very foundation of why I was there to study sexual qigong was rooted in a positive thing and a negative thing. And but it was ultimately coming from the negative side. The positive thing is that I desired and am called to sexual experiences of profound intimacy and of potency. The negative thing, which was the basis of why I was there, really, the shadow part that I wasn't able to recognize behind the glaze of this like heightened spiritual experiences I was seeking, which I still think are very valuable. So I'm not trying to ridicule that as I speak it, was that I held in myself a profound amount of sexual shame of inadequacy, of performance, of the meaning of my sexual, that it needed to be this ultimate, speaking to what you said, it needed to be this ultimate spiritual experience in order for it to be valuable, which is in direct opposition to my participation in pornography at the time. So it's like the delusional paradox there, or the paradox between these ideas is affronting. But when I recognized that, I was like, oh my God, like, why am I even here? And what I realized is that if I truly want to have, if those heightened, deep, powerful sexual moments of deep sexual intimacy is what I'm looking for, then the only way to get there is to first come to know what it is about myself that I was so deeply ashamed of. If I really wanted to step into the type of powerful intimacy that I was seeking, I was not going to get there making that intimacy all about altered states, sexual pleasure, entering altered states of consciousness that brought me into oneness as a way of evading those feelings. But a deep sense of oneness coming through the conduit of being truly vulnerable and intimate with myself in a way that allows me to reveal that to and with another, which can't be done if I'm just there to learn how to channel my through seminal retention, channel my arousal energy into peak consciousness, right? And so that's sort of like maybe an anecdote to talk about, what you're pointing to. And to talk about this kambo thing is that, and I'm going to maybe speak a little bit about the death of a person. And I understand, and it's very sensitive, and I apologize to you if it comes off as uncomfortable or anyone listening. I'm not trying to make light of it as I speak openly about it. I'm just trying to go for it. I think,
I just as a sort of thing there. I think these conversations, I think we're all agreed that we're talking about human experience, and that death is a part of that. Again, I'm very not happy, but I'm open to talking about things that around sort of suicide and things like that. It's so again, don't worry about it. I think I would say the audience probably agrees.
Sure, yeah, and at the same time, these are powerfully destructive experiences, as in they can completely destroy how your sense of what's okay with the world. And talking about the power and positivity of embracing those feelings can sound kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Could be characterized in the accusation veiled as an inquiry of, who the fuck do you think you are telling me about my experience? Okay. So, and I want to be mindful that as I'm talking about these things, I'm not trying to tell people what their experience should be, because the pain of these things is not something that we design ourselves to be really good at. It's going to devastate you nonetheless. And that doesn't make it easier simply by the fact that we're ready to let it devastate us. Or that it should be easy, or whatever it is. So connected with this whole description I just had about the sexual guilt and the seekings of basically spiritual reasons to evade it, or spiritual scaffolding by which I can sort of hide these feelings from myself, is the recognition that, these difficult experiences that we have, especially experiences of loss. Francis Weller says that, and he's a writer on grief. He wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He talks about being an apprentice of grief, or an apprentice of sorrow. Sorry, apprentice of grief is a different person. An apprentice of sorrow. And that when loss enters our life, when these moments of profound sorrow enter our life, our grieving process is the process by which we reorient ourselves around the gravity of those experiences. Mm-hmm. Okay. And if we aren't able to, excuse me, I just burped and I totally just walked away from it. If we're not able to let those things in a way that allows us to properly grieve them, then in what way are we orienting around them? So if I have the loss of a person in my life, and the way in which I orient around my grief from that is, based in the premise of how grief is understood in the Western world, which is that it is, the loss is an event and the grieving process is a linear process of more grief to less grief. And the sooner and the better, the more effectively you get to less grief, the healthier you are, mm-hmm. right? That if I engage it in this way, that the less I'm suffering, the less sorrow I'm in, the better. But what is the meaning of that person's life? What is truly the meaning of how you cared for that person if the response to that, the manner in which you reorient your life around their loss, is to be as far away from the pain of their absence as possible?
Yeah.
Because after a person's gone, the only presence they have in your life, or a significant presence that they have in your life is the degree to which you're able to recognize their absence. So if the absence is so painful that I make that pain go away, and so I no longer think about it, then what presence is that person having in my life?
Yeah.
Right? And also at the same time, we can't be expected to just like white knuckle that kind of thing. It's not easy, and it's not necessarily to the benefit of just, I don't know, to have your entire life decimated and everything fall apart. That isn't necessarily what serves you either. I don't know what the answers are to these things, but ultimately it's something like a deep, rich, and full life is not one that is ultimately positive in that everything feels good. I think the deep, rich, and full life is something that is born out of encountering the whole gambit of the felt experience of being alive. And that those depths of despair and pain are as much a part of that as the happiness process. And from a getting away from our pain, we're getting away from the things that we root our life in.
Yeah.
I know this seems weird, but again, a Robert Augustus Masters thing, if you have a tree and you say like the positive experiences are like the branches and the negative experience are like the roots, if we're not really feeling in to where life hurts, one end is we're not really going to be able to blossom really big because we don't have the nutrient factor. And the other thing is when a storm comes, that tree's coming down.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I kind of feel like now reflecting on how I've entered into this, I wasn't clear in what I wanted to say, and maybe it's clear for the people listening. But another thing that comes up is around something Stephen Jenkinson talks about, another person that I listen to quite a bit. I get a lot of sort of like feeling as though he is a place of wisdom for me to try to sense make life. And he talks about, grief being that grieving is a way of loving that which has slipped from view. Is that fair to say?
I think it's a beautiful statement, yeah.
And that loving is a way of grieving that which has yet to. The degree to which we love a thing is the degree to which we will grieve it once it's gone. And if we aren't willing to let ourselves feel the grief, then by what value do we continue to hold the love of that thing now that it's gone? And that thing can be a person, that thing can be your youth. You mentioned 20 years ago, you'd be off doing the thing. So I imagine you're in your, mid to late 30s at least, I assume.
Mid-40s, yeah.
There you go. At some point you must have come to recognize that the 4 or 5 days out, late night with your friends, the carefree, like sitting on top of a hill, you know, like watching the sunrise, sort of coming down, having a drink, that sort of freedom, that sort of like, at some point you got to recognize you'll never have that again.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a place of grief. And if you're not willing to welcome that in, then what value are you able to then place in the next phase of your life, even if you are no longer allowed to allow yourself to feel the impact of the things you once loved being absent? You know, and I don't know if this is clear, but I feel like if we want to truly navigate a rich and beautiful full life with each other, we need to be willing and familiar with how to be with our suffering and pain in a way that doesn't seek to vanquish it first, because the manners in which we usually seek to vanquish it first are actions and strategies that usually end up creating more harm in the process for ourselves and for those around us. And also, there's a certain point in which we need some sort of help in grappling with that in a way that doesn't ultimately create more grief and pain. You know, at some point it makes sense to take some kambo to try to get your feet back underneath you. And sometimes it makes sense to drink some ayahuasca or eat some mushrooms and really feel all that you're, despite your best effort, really unable to feel. And yeah, so for whatever that long sort of diatribe was, I hope people find something of value out of it.
Well, let me just tell you, I found something of value in it. So, and I'd just like to sort of, just to unpack a few things there. And so, I mean, first of all, I mean, that was a very beautiful diatribe. It really struck a chord with me. I think the thing, I don't like to use this particular word, but I think really what people should be aiming for is acceptance. You've got to be able to accept the sort of that your life's not going to be pure bliss or pure sort of happiness, or at least not in the way that sort of people think that it's going to be when they're looking for these kind of quick fixes of, you know, if I do this, then it will solve all my sort of problems. And as just in the description you use of grief, then I'll just inject sort of an anecdote of my own experience, which is, as I said, my mother killed herself when I was sort of 3 years old, and the reorienting that I had to do there to sort of get through it, which I obviously you're doing this unconsciously because a 3-year-old doesn't have the tools to be able to do this, and so I got to a point in my sort of 20s where I actually felt that I was very mentally sort of strong, because basically I managed to erect sort of emotional firewalls around this
nothing
thing.
Could touch you.
Yeah. And so, but of course, by doing this, erecting these kind of psychological firewalls, really what you're doing is kind of creating this sort of scar tissue. And at some point, there's going to be a reckoning for this big scar that's now running through the middle of your psychological makeup. And that is exactly what happened. I got to my mid-30s and it just sort of came crashing down, and I realized there was this void in my life which I just had no perception of even how to deal with. I didn't even have a concept of a person there to grieve. It's, you know, for most people have a mother. I don't. The person who you sort of, you know, it's almost a given that you know we have two parents. Mine just made a choice not to be there in one of the most gruesome ways possible, and I didn't even have a concept of that person to know what I was dealing with. But I knew there was something, I recognized that there was something there I need to deal with. So this is why one of the reasons I started looking to ayahuasca. So I went to do these retreats to try and how do I understand here what is even missing? And I knew when I went on those ayahuasca retreats that these were possibly going to be some of the worst moments of my existence. I knew this was not going to be a fun time, and I was absolutely right in that regard. And I think this is a tricky topic to discuss because, again, you know, some people will then say, well, why are you doing that? This is just masochism. Why would you do that? Why do you not just want the the happy thoughts? Why don't you just do whatever it takes to become enlightened, become awakened, and just have the happy bits? My thought was, no, I want this pain. I want to understand what I've lost. I want to understand this, to grieve, not just to grieve for the loss of a physical person, but to grieve for the love I never got to give that person, and the love, a child wants to give love as much as it wants to receive love. So there was all this kind of complex relationships, which I just walled off, thinking I was like a tough guy. And yeah, it was a very difficult set of lessons to go through, which I'm still going through to this day. This is not something that's resolved and done, and I'm not even sure that this is something I will ever have an end game on. But that's, and I think you've just articulated it beautifully. I'm now sort of recognizing that I need those roots that you're talking about from that tree, and I think they do make the structure stronger. And the idea I'd like to throw out there into the marketplace of ideas is, for people not necessarily to be afraid of that sort of that grief and these human things. And I think it's not to be confused with people torturing themselves or inflicting pain on themselves, but I think your human experience is a precious thing. And particularly in the example that you used in the kambo video, where you're talking about heartbreak, like what does your relationship mean if your heart is not broken at the end of this is these dark moments when you're feeling your heart in the sort of the pit of your stomach, in your mouth. When you reflect on them, particularly if you think, most of us can reflect back on something from our teenage years and think, these are like beautiful moments of the first moments of heartbreak, the first moment you got your heart trashed by somebody. But you recognize that there is something beautiful there. And again, I do find that one quite hard to articulate without sounding, completely masochistic. But I thought you just did a beautiful job of it. So thank you so much for just doing it off the top of your head. That was great.
I think there's a couple things, and thank you, and thank you for sharing. I'm so sorry to hear that you had to go through that experience as a young person. That's just like, it feels like just such a incredible tragedy for a small person to have to grapple with. There's something you said there, a couple things that I think is important to point at, which is like, to the best of my, and I'm wrapped up in this too, I'm trying, I speak with authority, but there's also this implicit, I'm speaking with authority in my tone, but there's a certain degree to which I feel like I think I know, but I don't really entirely know. And I certainly don't necessarily know for you. I mean, the proverbial you. But there's a couple of things there that I grapple with in myself. And one of which is this sort of degree of, again, I think about something Stephen Jenkins said, which is like, you're under no obligation to accept these things. You're under no obligation to be okay with the fact that people you loved died, or that you'll die. And at that moment, you'll say goodbye to not just everyone you've ever known, but everything you've ever known. And the very thing that is your life, you have to say goodbye to. Each of your individual people are saying goodbye to one person, and you're saying goodbye to all of them at once. And that is, you're under no obligation to be okay with that, to accept that as, and the degree to which we will say, oh, we shouldn't be afraid of those things, or we can learn to be not afraid of them. We are learn to just accept them, is like this weird reverse heroism, which is like, instead of entirely avoiding the feelings, we create this strength where we can have the feelings, and there's no reason to be afraid, and there's no reason to, let it take you down. But it's like, there's a pretty goddamn good reason to be afraid. I mean, there's a damn good reason for you to be afraid of those feelings. They fucking hurt. They're likely going to devastate you. There's a reason why you built those walls up. Right. And the reason is social, it's cultural, it's contextual, but it's ultimately because you were not safe to feel those feelings at the time, or at least you didn't feel so. And so feeling those feelings means also having to grapple with the fact that you didn't feel safe, and maybe you don't feel safe now, and that that coming to say, I'm going to do my best to be with what hurts when it hurts, and to learn that, and to learn how to let grief have its way with me, is not a way in which we stand strong. You know, it's a way in which we learn how to let ourselves be wrecked, you know, and that doesn't necessarily, and even saying that, it's like, you know, there's nothing courageous, there doesn't feel like anything fearless or like heroic in me having moments where things are just so intense that I just have to curl up in a ball and just fucking cry, because it's just, sometimes life is just so hard. There's nothing heroic about that. Mm-hmm. That's hard, but it's real, you know? And without that, something's missing. You know, there's a part of yourself, a part of your life, a part of what truly defines the value of the things that you do have, that you still have for now, you know, that can't be accessed if we don't let ourselves feel how fucking hard things can be too, mm-hmm. you know? And like I said, the strategies that come up around it ultimately create more harm than just feeling the feelings, you know, assuming we are able to develop the capacity internally and develop the structures interpersonally to be able to feel those feelings with as much sense of safety as possible, which again is no easy task.
Yeah.
Right.
And the thing you mentioned as well around the kind of the perception of the linear flow of these things, like, you know, you start off at 100% grief, and then 4 weeks later you're at 50% grief, and at that point you can go back to work and get back on with your life, and you just get over it. You just get over it in time, and you're fine. And that's just complete bullshit. You know, you can very often, people start off with, you know, a blank slate of not being able to deal with anything, and then, you know, 10 months down the line you're just howling at the gods for, you know, like wanting to just burn the earth because your pain is so strong. So I think our entire models based around how we handle these sort of grief things really need to change, and I've got no idea on what those could be. I think, you know, particularly in terms of how the mainstream medicates for that, and this is not an attack on sort of on the mainstream medicine or anything, but, you know, certainly there was a situation where my, you know, me and my wife, we lost a baby, and, you know, she was understandably devastated, and so, you know, she just handed over a jar of pills and said, you know, take these, and she wasn't depressed. She was grieving. She was going through unimaginable pain. But yeah, the sort of the answer is take these antidepressants, and come back in 4 weeks. If you need some more, I'll give you some more. And that's just completely a messed up model, and something I think we're going to have to address. And maybe that's something that can come up as part of this. I think that is one of the things where psychedelics can help. It's certainly something I've seen on ayahuasca retreats, is being able to just tap into these veins of grief or sorrow or whatever, and just let it sort of fly out. And it's gruesome. It
can be, yeah.
Especially if people are not sort of ready for how deep those things can go. And I probably wasn't at first, but I definitely found it incredibly beneficial. I think I've lost my train of thought a bit.
Maybe I'll just comment on something there, because
sure.
I think it's Samur. You can connect with me afterwards, and I can give you a link. You can put this in the comments or the description here. I went to the International Death Symposium in Toronto in 2017, and there was a man talking about this sort of like dysfunctional model that we have of like the ascent from grief, you know, and the actuality of it is that there's chronic grief and acute grief. And once we incur it, like once the loss is there, you know, like this is specifically grappling with the grief of a specific person dying and its aftermath, is that it's not like the further you get away from it, the better you feel and the less grief there is. It's just that the longer we live life, the more we're able to sort of like, reorient ourselves back in life with that grief as a part of us. But that doesn't make the grief go away. That he says, he uses the term that we circumambulate the moment of grief for the rest of our lives. Circumambulate is sort of a term that is like a religious circling of a thing. So Muslims, they circumambulate I don't know what it's called, like the big rock.
Big stone thing, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's like a thing. And I think so it's like this almost religious level of circling. The thing that you're circling is something that is sacred, and that around that time every year, and people who experience grief or have experienced the death of a loved one probably notice that there are certain times in the year that it comes back, because you're coming back on the day to which that many years ago someone you deeply loved left this earth,
Mm-hmm.
and that isn't pathology, and there's also room wherein there is the appropriate use of pharmacological tools of emotional mitigation that could allow people to get their feet underneath them so that they can actually have the capacity within themselves to then start doing what's necessary. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so there's a role there, and psychedelics can play a role in that. So can, like benzodiazepines, as long as there's the appropriate context in which people are still helped to deal with stuff. But again, I'm just talking out loud. I don't know what the answers are, but I'm just talking out loud. Of course I'm talking out loud. I'm thinking out loud. I don't know what the answers are. And I'm still coming to understand these things too, but I think about grief as the consequence of loving, of deeply loving something. And that I'm lucky in the fact that I haven't experienced the death of one of my parents yet. I've experienced the death of a close friend. I've experienced the death of a few, close but not as close friends. I've been proxy to the death and been with friends during the death of their parents, and around them and saw what they've gone through. And yet I hope, I don't know if hope is the right thing. I feel like it's depressing to think that the death of somebody I love would be something I'd want to get over, And again, I don't want to come off as like the heroic or speaking down. Like everyone has to manage in the way that they, are able to best manage for their lives. But I hope that I want to have relationships with people that are so meaningful and so deep that when they're gone, I'll never be the same again. Mm-hmm. Because they touched my life so much so that their absence leaves an unreconcilable mark on me. And I've said this in a couple podcasts as well about the relationship I have with my partner, and that I want and engage that partnership in a way that it's like complex, but when she is to die, if she dies first, that I will never be the same again. And I don't want to be, that my heart will be broken and I'll never want it to heal, because the place in which it is broken is the place that holds her, and, yeah, I mean, like now we got onto a whole other thing, but we can think about that in a number of less intense sort of scenarios as well. That letting in the pain of life is the means by which we can sort of, I guess, orient ourselves to, feel the fullness of life when it's good again.
Yeah, and I think the example that you mentioned earlier, I think is a really good and probably very understated one. Is I wonder if sort of grief is too strong a word there, but recognizing the transitions through a person's own life as you go from sort of teenager through to sort of young adults, through to the time when you settle down, through to as you sort of you move into sort of your middle ages, your sort of twilight years. I think just recognizing these transitions. Again, you don't really get much of a chance to do this when you're younger, because you're just on too much of an invincibility run of like, yes, just awesome. But certainly I think it's something that happens around my stage. I mean, obviously the term midlife crisis, I think, is there for a reason. People suddenly have this collision of like, whoa, holy shit, like who am I? What am I doing here? How did I get here? And I think being able to have these sort of tools and sort of reflect on it, think, oh yeah, okay, I need to make pace with that. I'm not a young buck anymore, and whatever I thought I was going to have accomplished by the time I turned 30, maybe I'm not now, or maybe I didn't. I just didn't realize it. Maybe I sort of, maybe I didn't make the best of those times, or maybe I did make the best of those times, and I should be, grateful for that and use that to orient myself for the next phase of my life. So I think these kind of emotional landmarks are sort of very easily swept under the carpet in service of this idea of everything should be blissful and happy and enlightened, as it were. And if we just to sort of shift the gear a bit, I mean, did you have any particular thoughts around the topic of like enlightenment? Is that a thing for you, or what does that mean to you? Or
yes, I have some thoughts that are coming up, or we'll see what happens when I start talking about it. But one thing I want to point out is something about just to end, something about building relationships, that the structure of the relationship is a place wherein we learn to feel safe and hold each other in difficulty, which requires to a certain degree learning how to hold it in ourselves, but also the recognition, and going back to Francis Weller, is that like grief is too much for any one individual, and that if you are alone in it, there's no shame in recognizing that it's too much, because it is, and that, again, even in myself, as I talk about it, I notice sometimes I go into this is how completely inadequate I realize I am to staying strong, and how I don't actually want to. There's like a whole lot of psychological stuff. And then there are other moments where I'm like, kind of come off as I'm like, yeah, the thing, you do the thing, and you just pass through that grief and you just let it hurt you. And that in and of itself is the way in which, despite my best efforts, the defenses still come up,
Well, and I think both of those things are true. I think, I think it's not exclusive. You do have to surrender to these things. I mean, again, this is true of sort of grief or even like a psychedelic experience. You do have to sort of kind of have a certain gung-ho of, just go and do it. But in doing that, then I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with like cowering and howling and sort of, and realizing how much this is affecting you. And I think that there was some quote I was reading somewhere. It was around about sort of, soldiers in combat or something like that, and that the heroic ones are not the ones who are completely fearless in the face of danger, and who are sort of diving into combat, sort of guns are blazing like Rambo or something like that. It's the ones who are absolutely feeling that fear but do it anyway. They know that this is the kind of the job they are giving themselves to do. So it's not like, come on, what's wrong with you pussies? Let's go do it. It's the ones who are like, shit, no, I'm absolutely terrified, but let's kind of go. And I think that's the mentality to have around these things. Sometimes you just got to get shit done, but you can absolutely feel the gravity of that situation as you go and react accordingly. But it's a kind of a bit of a. It seems like a bit of a contradiction, but I don't think it is.
And it's also, it's also so much bigger than what either of us are able to speak to in the time frame that we have, or even able to understand through the lens in which we're presently understanding it, in the context in which we're talking about it, which is just you and I emergent by what's happening. There are pieces missing. There are threads dropped. There are things yet to be revealed. There are things yet to be understood. There are things understood that won't make sense to later, or only make sense in hindsight. So there's a lot there. It's very complex, and I think it's important to hold that too, because all this talk about death and grief and all the rest of it, we're talking about it as if we have a sense of the thing, and each of us have a sense of what that thing is in us, and what we both feel maybe makes more or less sense from a healthy, processing, good life situation. But also these things, grief, death, love, nature, these are all things that are actually way bigger than our ideas about them. And our ideas about them, they also have no stock in what our ideas about them are, ultimately. They show up as they are, regardless of what we think or feel about them. And we just try to figure it out, and hopefully, and we're trying to figure it out here as best we can. And there's a beauty in that. I think that is the absolute beauty of these relationships, or these conversations is, everything that has just been said, I think is completely through our own the lens of our own subjective experience. None of it's right, none of it's wrong. It's just that's kind of it. And I think somewhere in this conversation that I've certainly found some value, and I'm very grateful for that, James. And hopefully, I guess the thing that we aim for with these kind of conversations in putting them out is that somebody else will also find some sort of value. And but I think, and I certainly think people will. And I said, regardless whether they do or not, I definitely have. So thank you for your stream of consciousness. Thanks. Before I move on to your enlightenment, I kind of said that thanks as though passing of my way of trying to not accept the graciousness of your recognition. So I'm going to take that back. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Before I move on to the question that you just said about the enlightenment, maybe I'll just, for the listeners, the people who I mentioned, in case you want to sort of dive into their ideas, who are by and far, in my opinion, hell of way more authorities on the subject than I am, as I try to reiterate what I've learned from them, is Stephen Jenkinson, his book Die Wise, Francis Weller, his book The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and also I remember the name Samit Kumar, his book Grieving Mindfully. Although Samit Kumar's YouTube videos are very lo-fi and not super engaging, his work is really beautiful. Because chances are we're first going to look up on YouTube, who are these people? Those are people. Oh, and Robert Augustus Masters' Spiritual Bypassing and Transformation Through Intimacy are places of inspiration and people who I am inspired by and where I was talking is coming from. So those are places for follow-up for your listeners. So enlightenment, I don't know, really. I don't think I'm enlightened. I don't think I understand I think I sometimes have a sense of what people mean when they say enlightenment. I'm not convinced that's what enlightenment is. And I think it all depends on the content, the sort of cultural and cultural, ideological / mythological, and I mean myth from the Campbell way of things, not myth as an indirect way of saying fantasy or false or fiction. The context in which we're talking about enlightenment. And I'm not sure where my own thoughts are. I feel like I've had moments of enlightenment where I've been enlightened, as in the light of awareness was brought to aspects of myself and of existence where previously, awareness, it was inaccessible to my conscious awareness. I've had moments in which I felt as though I was profoundly connected with the isness as me, and maybe that is an enlightenment type experience. But I don't think I want to particularly comment on what I think it is or isn't. Although I will say that I found a lot of value in a model of understanding that was put out by a man named Douglas Tatarin. He's a clinical psychologist out of Winnipeg, and his work. Him and his daughter Allie took his work and applied it to circling, the circling process. He has a whole thing called the bioemotive framework, and he's reformatted Ken Wilber's four facets of transformation to sort of fit his bioemotive model. And the whole spiral dynamics integral thing is worn in. And if this is a bunch of jargon for people listening, don't worry about it. But the premise he puts out is that like there are 4 facets of human transformation, and only one of them is waking up. Right. And so usually when people talk about enlightenment, you mentioned, Stephen, you mentioned Leo Gura. It's like this waking up thing, this awakening, this sort of like coming to be revealed to the truthness or the isness or the whatever. And that's only one aspect of transformation, right? That's an important aspect, coming to sort of like wake up to the fact that I am not my thoughts, coming to wake up to the fact that I am not my body. I am not even the recognition that I am not my thoughts or my body or my emotions, and that like I am not even that which I perceive reality to be, So there's like all these layers of the waking up process. Sure. Yeah. But that these other facets are as important to consider, which is that there's the waking up, but then there's the cleaning up, growing up. And he calls it looking around, but Wilber calls it showing up, which I think is a little bit more like from a branding perspective, a little bit easier to remember. And he says like the cleaning up process is like, okay, so you wake up, you recognize I am not necessarily what I believe myself to be. Things are not necessarily what I believe them to be. And then the cleaning up is the process by which we then try to figure out where the distortions are in ourselves and resolve those distortions. And those can be emotional distortions, intellectual distortions, physical distortions. Intellectual distortions maybe being like, being unaware of the fact that we're constantly propagating a logical fallacy in the way in which we're understanding a thing. An emotional distortion might be, constantly carrying around some, he calls it accidental conditioned history from our past, which becomes like the frame by which we interpret all events therein, even like all events closely related therein, in a way that, it disables us from being able to actually recognize what's really happening. We're just seeing our own sort of like our own stuff being projected onto it and then believing that to be why that person did that thing. And that's why I feel this way, this kind of stuff. And then we need to go in and clean that stuff up too. But that we also need to grow up, and that growing up is the way in which we sort of update ourselves and our engagement with the world as a consequence of who we think we are and what we think things to be, grinding up against what reality actually is. And that we need to sort of accept that we didn't really know, that we weren't really doing a good job or whatever it is, and sort of update that in accordance to living the life. And that is the growing up process. And then looking around is where we develop the skills to perceive and engage things that otherwise were inaccessible to us. So for example, we could develop the skill of recognizing body language, right? Which was otherwise invisible. We could develop the skill of sort of working with energy in some way or another. We can, as in like walking into a room and being able to like feel things out, navigate and even engage other people based on how things feel and recognize what you're bringing to it and seeing if you can, like calibrate things differently, which to some degree or another, possibly energy workers are attempting to do in some way or another. Although I don't know, I'm not going to speak with authority on that because I don't know, that's a whole world that I once dabbled in, but don't want to speak to. But it also could be in a way in which, shamans learn to see things and perceive and engage things that otherwise are invisible to us, but have actual impact in some way or another, be those things spirits or I don't know, So his 4 facets of transformation, Douglas the Tar and bioemotive, I think that to me, although it isn't an answer to your question, it's a way in which I'm trying to sidestep and say, I don't really know, but I think that this is a good model for which I have come to understand how much I didn't recognize about what enlightenment is and isn't. And so possibly that's a place for your listeners to find some value too. Yeah,
I think that sounds like a model I would, just based on that short sort of condensed version, something I would agree with. I think the way I see it being used within the sort of psychedelic discourse is really as enlightenment is the end game. This is the end game, and you get there as fast as possible to, again, with the goal of zero suffering. This is, you launch your yacht onto calm seas, and then your feet are up, and it's like la 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 la, and life is golden after that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not convinced that's. I think this ties into this kind of, this drive-through spirituality that I've talked about. I think that's not necessarily it. If there is a thing called enlightenment, then I see it as like this ongoing process where I don't think there's ever actually the point where you just put your feet up and okay, that's it, I'm done. No more enlightenment required. So yeah, I see it as it's just a race, a race without an end goalpost. And that, I don't mean to make that sound as though it's something futile or not worth doing. I think it's, it's a cliche, but the journey is is where the magic happens, I think. Mm-hmm. I got a friend who had a sort of a good quote. It was, enlightenment is the ongoing process of realizing how stupid you were 2 weeks ago. And I think that's a kind of amusing but sort of reasonable way of capturing the kind of the constant motion of it. So yeah, I think I'll definitely check out that author that you mentioned. It sounds like an interesting take on it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like enlightenment is a loaded term, so there's the Buddhist enlightenment, and isn't necessarily the enlightenment that isn't, Buddhist as in like specific Buddhist like sect, I think is the word I'm looking for, that pocket of Buddhism, like Theravada Buddhism. They'll describe what enlightenment is. And as far as they're concerned, that is what it is. And according to Buddhism, that is what it is. But I think there's some sort of like fast and loose sort of like hodgepodging in modern culture, modern Western culture, modern Western, the dominant unculture of North America, you could say, or the Western world. Mm-hmm. That's just like a hodgepodge of stuff and then thrown it together and being like, it's this, and then trying to apply it. And that very sort of like, it is the conquest. It is the conquest that is the arrival upon the ultimate. And that the sooner, the faster, the first, the better. I think that that's a distortion maybe, and a distortion that doesn't actually lead to a better life, or a richer life or a fuller life. If I thought of it, even going back to sexuality, if I said to you that the apex of the sexual experience is the orgasm, and the faster you can get there, the better your sex, okay, but then what about, and that the sooner you get there, the sooner you can be done, is basically like me saying like the best sex is the stuff that you get where you come quickly and never do it again, rather than recognizing it's a whole long journey in which we're in an intimate exchange with a life that is beyond us, that is comprised, of a person, but it's comprised of desires, wants, needs, boundaries, expectations, likes, unlikes, like that there's this complex being that we're in a relational dance with, and the journey together that we come through and wave through things that include orgasm, is the way in which we sort of encounter and explore and get to experience the richness of the sexual exchange, including perhaps, like love and romance and like deep bonded intimacy and all the rest, right? And that even itself being a part of a larger system of relating with another person. And yet it's not necessarily another person. It's all of life, and everyone and everything, not just people, that we are engaging with, that we are being, touched by, changed by, and that we are touching and changing in turn. And all the complexities that go around that. And to think that there's a one-shot place that we can go, and that the faster, the better we get there, the better we are in order to have achieved the goal of the human experience, I think it's a fallacy, and I think it's wrong. And I could be wrong, and I'm ready to be told that I'm wrong. I'm ready to disagree with people. I'm ready to be exposed for the fact that my thinking was wrong, and so I have to go back and readdress it. But that's my thoughts presently. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's an awesome analogy, and I'm probably going to have to steal that one from you, James.
Right. No citation needed. Please go for it.
Yeah, because I mean, again, it is something that pretty much all of us can relate to the sexual experience, and we recognize the value in putting something extra into that beyond the faster, quicker, in the shortest time span possible. So I'm definitely going to poach that one for you. And I would say that that's probably a good place to wrap it up, James, because
enlightenment is the end, so we might as well end it there. We've made it to the apex of the conversation.
Until the next reincarnation. I just want to say, I'd thank you so much for the time to have this conversation, James. I think we started at the beginning that this was a conversation to go off the rails, and I think it did go off the rails in the most spectacular way possible. And it's one that I'm certainly going to sort of enjoy rewatching and sort of reflecting on. And so really, thanks a lot, mate. A big fan of your work, and I'll keep watching. And please do send me that list of authors just so I can pop it in the description, and so people can follow up for it. And I think that was probably a good place for me to stop recording.
Okay, well, Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciated this conversation as well. So thank you for having me on the show. Thank you for doing what you do. I really appreciate your the work that you're putting out on YouTube. And do you mind if I do a little thing to tell people where they can find me, or is that something that you add into an outro?
Look, James, after all your spiritual talk, please go for it. The floor is yours, mate.
Thank you. For anyone interested in following my work, my channel's name is Adventures Through the Mind. It's also the name of my podcast, which is my channel. And you can find everything that I do, including my writing, videos, podcasts, and lectures that I've given that are recorded and put online at jameswjesso.com. And that's it.
And I'll include all links to that in the description below. Once again, thanks a lot, James, and I will bid you good night, sir.
Goodbye.